Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola, and I'm joined by Dr. Eric Rush. Do you want to introduce yourself for a second?
Hi, Chris. Great to be here. It's been a few weeks since I've been on A Fork in Time or Rumor It Happened, but I'm happy to talk today. We have a really exciting episode, and I think we'll have a lot of fun. Chris and I were talking off podcast about it quite a bit, and I think we're going to have a good time with a few scenarios here and a little bit more of an extended what did happen. So I think that will be fun for all the listeners.
Yeah. So the topic of today's episode is the Spanish flu of 1918. And so do you want to talk a little bit about what did happen from the epidemiological perspective, from the medical side of this, Eric?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think by now everybody has become amateur virologists, and even those people who aren't amateur virologists have come to style themselves that way. So I think a lot of us have become really inundated with a lot of information about viruses, and most of it lately has been about coronavirus. But even before we had the coronavirus pandemic, what we had was endemic influenza. And we've had that for certainly as long as I've been around, and far longer than that. But in this case, we're dealing with the 1918, what was called the Spanish flu. And this was a complete misnomer, by the way. This was what was called the Spanish flu was very much an influenza that started in North America and did not actually originate in Spain. The reason why it was thought to originate in Spain is because we were in the middle of a world war. And Chris is going to talk in greater detail about what that meant for the war effort. But in this case, Spain was neutral. And Spain being neutral, they didn't have censorship on their newspapers. And so when it became apparent from Spanish press that there was an influenza pandemic that was going around, the moniker stuck. Whereas the belligerents in the Great War did have censorship, and so they didn't really want to talk about it.
I also feel like it's kind of though Spain is like the only country in Europe that is not having trouble counting how many people are just dropping like flies all around them.
Absolutely. And this was a very interesting pandemic. And part of the reason why I'm on this podcast is because it's fun. But the other reasons are that I'm a physician, and this is really interesting to me. Part of the reason is because I'm from Kansas, and Kansas will feature greatly in this pandemic. Because as far as we know, the earliest documented case in March of 1918 was in Fort Riley, which is located in Kansas, a little bit southwest of a city called Manhattan. Manhattan is home to a little junior college known as Kansas State University. It's a secondary college to the University of Kansas, but it's okay. It's a pretty good place. And so this is something that happens within, at least initially, the state of Kansas, as far as we know. Now, we don't really know whether it originated in Kansas. In fact, the data would suggest that it probably did not. But they equally suggest that it probably originated someplace in North America. And that will be very interesting, not only for the what did, but it'll be very interesting for the what if that we will get to a little bit later. Because Chris and I have some interesting ideas for the what if. And they're a little bit competing ideas. And I want to preface this. So when we were talking off podcast, when we were just talking about what we wanted to do here, I was very reliably making the mistake and saying things like 2018 and 2019. I will probably do that when we're talking again. So if I do, just know that what I'm talking about is 1918 and 1919, or those other dates in the 20th century, and we're not talking about more recent pandemics that happened in the 21st century. So with that preface,
also given with what literally jumped off this morning, I will probably make sure to be referencing the First World War as opposed to a possible third one, which may or may not be coming.
These are very interesting times we live in, and so indeed we may be seeing the opening salvos of a very, very different conflict here than what we'd anticipated, unfortunately.
So let's get to the what did. In 1914, Europe decided to tear itself apart, and had a lot of fun with that. And basically, everybody's kind of familiar with what happens. And right towards the end of it, kind of in 1918, when basically what happens, and we'll come back to more of the details on this. The American Army is being trained in the United States, and it's almost a perfect setting to start a virus and to have it spread like wildfire, because you're taking a bunch of people, you're putting them in campsites that do not have sanitation, that do not have the space that people are used to, and then you're moving them around so that they can reinfect other people. Basically, the United States, and assuming what we understand is correct about this, it starts at training camps in the Kansas area. Troops from there are probably transferred to other facilities, spread it to these other facilities, and lo and behold, the United States dropped some biological warfare right in the middle of World War I, without even thinking about it. The troops go over to Europe, and it spreads all across the continent. And as I understand the flu of 1918, one of the reasons it's not as known or as talked about, I kind of alluded to it a little bit on the Spanish issue, this is right in the middle of World War I. You have a lot of other causes of death. You have a lot of other disruption of the continent. And when it hits it started March 1918. It travels to Europe. The cold and flu season of 1918-19 basically matches up pretty nicely with the end of the war in November 1918. And in Germany, you are still dealing with mass civilian starvation. You're dealing with, even on the other, further into Asia, Russia's in the middle of a civil war. And so there's a lot else to think about. There's a lot else going on all over the world at this point, that the influenza of the Spanish or the Kansas flu, could we call it the Jayhawk bird flu? Maybe, I don't know.
I would recommend that we not do that.
Okay,
that we not call it the. But when we think about it, I would not support, for obvious reasons, calling it the Jayhawk flu. But what I would say that is correct is the precursor to the 1918 influenza was almost certainly an avian influenza gene pool. Mm-hmm. So this was almost certainly an avian origin. We don't know as much about that at this point. Where we are now, we have some very sophisticated tools, as you might imagine, for understanding more about the origin of viruses. And so that's why when this same general sort of influenza came around in 2009, which was the swine flu H1N1, we understood where it came from, and we understood a lot more about it. Now, that H1N1 in 2009 was still appreciably different than its ancestor. And I do say ancestor deliberately, because all really current seasonal influenzas are in many ways descendants of that 1918 human H1N1. Very interesting that that's the case. And some of those lines have become extinct, but many of them are still extant. Many of them are still around and are causing seasonal flu. And these are some of our more common ones that we know as seasonal H1N1 and seasonal H3N2. And these designations have to do with two proteins that are on the outside of the influenza virus, which we call hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And that's the H and the N. And for the sake of this podcast, those are not necessarily important, but just know that when we're talking about the H and the N number, those are the reasons why. These are the individual types of those hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and those make them a little bit distinct from one another. So there's just so the listeners know that there is a reason why we have this alphanumeric nomenclature for influenza viruses, is because they're somewhat different from each other based on those two chemicals. So that's all I'm going to say about that. This is not an infectious disease lecture, and this still is a fork in time, because that's really what we're wanting to do. The only other thing I would say is like a lot of pandemics, and like the current pandemic, I think people were in some cases very surprised to see multiple waves of coronavirus between the spring of 2019. Excuse me, I made a different mistake here, Chris. Spring of 2020.
Okay. And
the current time. So people were very surprised to see multiple waves of this. I think most of us in the medical profession were not surprised, because this is what we generally see with these. And in fact, in the influenza pandemic of 1918, we saw 4 discernible waves. Mm-hmm. The first one in early 2018 was relatively mild. Did I just say 2018?
Yes, you did.
I probably just say 2018. I told everybody that.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. The first wave in early 1918 was relatively mild. The second wave, which occurred in later 1918, was much more significant. And this originated in the late summer and appears to have corresponded, as Chris, you mentioned, with a lot of the troop movements between North America and Europe. So it's very interesting that this happened. And this was significantly disruptive to just troop movements. It wasn't necessarily significantly disruptive to the overall war effort writ large, which Chris is going to come to in a bit, but it was still interesting. The third wave in 1919 was milder than the second wave, but still more significant than the first wave. And then the fourth wave occurred in 1920 and seemed to be significant for multiple U.S. cities, including those in the Midwest were hit particularly hard, including where I'm sitting now in Kansas City. There's a lot of these that were impacted in the fourth wave. And then by the end of 1920, it was clear that this pandemic had evolved to a much less deadly endemic virus, and then subsequently was only noted to cause seasonal influenza and return to pre-pandemic levels. So there were 4 discernible waves between 1918 and 1920 that occurred as a function of this. And so we should not be so surprised that our current pandemic has also lasted a couple of years.
Were these waves of the same type of the virus, or were there mutation, different strains like we've seen?
Yeah, that's actually that's challenging for us to understand, because we know that the 1918 pandemic was caused by an H1N1, and it seems as though there were changes that resulted over the course of time, and we know that really all of the seasonal influenza were descendants of that 1918 virus. Mm-hmm. We do know that What is not clear to me, and this is also, again, I'm not an infectious disease, I'm different specialty, but it's not clear to me whether we really understand what some of that what are those very subtle changes that occurred between 1918 and 1920 how they affected it.
Okay.
Because we're sequencing so many different viruses now, we have a very good understanding of what's going on. But obviously, we had no ability to do that in 1918, and so we do have to make some assumptions.
Okay. So just kind of finishing out what did happen. The virus traveled to Europe, as you said, with the second wave, and it devastated the continent. But there was a lot of other stuff devastating the continent. What we talked about a little bit was how much worse it was in some countries than others, primarily because of everything else going on.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically in Germany, you've got this virus hitting a population that had just survived what they called the turn-up winter, because they did not have any food in the country whatsoever. You had mass starvation, and that leads to a population that is more susceptible when the virus hits them. Is that a fair statement?
It is. It is a fair statement that if you have a more susceptible host, you're going to have a tendency for more mortality. The other thing that we noticed, which was very different than the current pandemic, is that many of the deaths were not in the young or the old, as we usually assume they are, but they were actually in young adults. Okay. So we usually think about young adults between the ages of 20 and 40 as being some of our most resistant to disease, and in most cases that's true. But in this case, that wasn't what happened. We actually saw a higher mortality in those young adults. Why is that? We think that what happened was that there was an over-exaggerated immune response from some of the young adults. Again, young adults generally have really nice, good, functional immune systems. But the problem is the immune systems aren't perfect. And oftentimes people who are young with intact immune systems may have experienced what we called cytokine storm, which is a fancy way of saying certain chemicals that circulate in the blood when people have infections were higher than what you might actually want. And the problem is those chemicals are signaling chemicals that come with some consequences, and you can go too far, and you can develop some other infections, including a condition called ARDS, which can also relate to secondary infections. And in fact, one of the things that killed people with influenza in 1918 and still sometimes kills people now is that you can develop a secondary pneumonia with bacteria on top of your viral influenza infection. And that oftentimes is not very good. It's not very good in 2022. It's definitely not very good in 1918 when you had access to no antivirals and no antibiotics. So it can be a real problem in people.
Okay.
The other things that I would say is I will be biased against my own profession and biased towards a related profession. We in the medical profession, who are physicians in 1918 to 1920, had essentially nothing to offer these patients. Again, I mentioned to you that there were no treatments of any meaning for patients. The best that sometimes you could do was giving patients aspirin. You could argue that maybe aspirin was not such a bad idea. At least it would give some anti-inflammatory effect for that cytokine storm. Aside from that, not a lot. The medical profession that really made a difference in this pandemic were the nurses. And again, I say this with some bias. My wife's a nurse. Some of my best friends are nurses. And so the nursing profession advocated for the use of cloth masks in these patients. They advocated for sanitation. They advocated for distancing for patients and people who are potentially exposed. And they also advocated for patients being well cared for and well fed. All of those, as it turns out, were very reasonable things to do in this case when you don't have anything else specific to do from the medical sense. And so, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, is the nurses were very much the heroes of this from the medical profession, and what this related to was some of the more kind of professionalism of the nursing profession. The nursing profession in 2022 is very much a professional status, as it should be. But before some of this happened, it wasn't necessarily as such, and so I think that this improved the professional status of nurses.
Okay. So have we covered what did?
I think so.
You think? Okay. Yeah. So let's go to the first kind of my suggested fork, which basically pushes the timeline up. And again, we talked about the circumstances that led to it spreading the way it did, which were bringing together all of these healthy young men for the war effort and putting them in military unsanitary camps. That started with the U.S. entry into the war in April 1917.
Right.
Basically 11 months before when we saw it actually happen. Is that a fair?
I think that's accurate. I think we can move it back by 11 months. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't necessarily even have to change a lot in terms of the circumstances. It could still be a virus that was identified in Kansas. Off podcast, Chris had mentioned that maybe this originated in a slaughterhouse in Kansas City. Aside from the mild dig from a North Carolinian to a Kansas Cityan, that's not a crazy thing to think.
Yeah.
That absolutely.
Also, it just works so well with the analogy to the current ideas about wet markets where the current COVID-2 might have originated. So we're pushing that up so that almost as soon as the U.S. enters the war, we start getting sick troops. Process is the exact same way. The United States exports it to Europe, but now that second wave you talked about hits the fall winter of 1917 going into 1918.
Presumably that would be true.
Right.
So if we want to keep the intervals between the waves, or essentially amongst the multiple waves, then you would think that the second wave, which was quite deadly, would have happened, as you say, around, we'll say, September to October of 1918.
Okay.
1917.
Yes.
I'm really not doing a good job with dates today, Chris. I don't know what's going on. But we'll say September to October of 1917, and that would be quite a different impact than August of 1918 as it happened in our timeline.
Yes. Because right now, like we mentioned, you still got a Europe, and I'm still thinking about a German population ready for this.
Yes.
Ready for this in the worst possible way. Let me clarify that. Not ready in a response way, ready in if you are sitting here trying to map out a perfect situation to throw a virus into a population and have it spread, this is Europe in 1917 and 1918. In this fork, it's safe to say it spreads the same way, but when it does hit Germany, they're still in the war.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that most people don't or skip over about Germany in the First World War, they surrendered when the home front collapsed.
Right.
The German people got fed up and overthrew the Kaiser. Yes, the German army was on its way back. It had, but it hadn't happened yet. So if on top of all of the war privations, now you've got this virus running through everything. And I'll throw it to Eric. Do you think you have what happens at the end of 1918 happening earlier in 1918?
Yeah, I think you probably have much the same. I mean,
Okay.
would the death tolls be subtly different?
Mm-hmm.
You'd mentioned that we're kind of compounding famine on a lot of this a little later in the war, and that may have had some additional implications. But then it may not have. Again,
Mm-hmm.
some of your highest mortalities were found in some of your presumably healthiest people.
Mm-hmm.
Your adults, generally speaking, from ages 20 to 40. And the absolutely highest population in terms of mortality were pregnant women. So again, these were women who were pregnant, for one, which has some different physiologic changes. But these were also, being pregnant, they were relatively young women, and they were also previously healthy enough to become pregnant, which is in many cases not a mean feat, especially if you are in the middle of a famine. So you are taking, in the pregnant women, you're taking probably some of your healthier people, and they're dying in greater numbers. And so it's not immediately clear that there is an automatic assumption that the numbers of people who died is going to be appreciably lower in this earlier departure. So this actually may be in many ways just as devastating and even more disruptive, depending on where it is in the war.
I think it's more.
I think it's more disruptive.
More deadly, because when that second wave you're talking about does hit at the end of 1918,
right,
the war is over. The British still have the blockade somewhat, but you start seeing people able to deal or pay attention to the virus, as opposed to right in the middle of the war, there's no help on the way. So it's and I'm focusing mainly on its effect on Germany, because I'm going to throw something really interesting into this.
Okay, please do.
All of those pregnant women that are dying in 1918 in our scenario, but maybe 1917, when are those unborn sons hitting maturity?
Okay, I see where you're going in this one. So if we're doing the math on this one, these are these young men.
Let's make sure we're doing the math on 19, not 20. Go ahead.
On 1917. So they're pregnant in 1917 then, and so let's assume that the most of them will deliver sometime in 20. I don't know. This is too late
told you.
I know. 1918. And so these young men would reach maturity, assuming, or at least age of majority at 18 in 1936, which 1936 is quite a year for Germany.
Yes. And the other thing is, if it like we laid out, if it's hitting Germany much harder than it does the rest of Europe, all throughout the 1920s, this is a problem that France is facing, which is they know the demographic situation facing them, that their birth rate is lower. By 1936, they're not going to have the conscription classes that Germany is.
Right.
That can change a lot of their decision making. and what they do and what's available for Germany.
That's true.
Yeah.
So are you trying to prevent the Second World War, Chris?
I you know what? I did an entire episode trying to do it, and I said
I know
this
you
would
did.
never happen. Yeah.
So, okay, I've got an idea here, and
Yeah.
we're and just so the listeners know, we're totally off the rails here. We didn't talk about any of this stuff. And we may or may not get to my thoughts on this. And
I do love the
totally
video
fine.
because I could see Eric's face when he counted up. Oh wow, what's happening in 20 years after
Right.
this?
So you have simultaneously, you have a potentially a quicker German capitulation.
Mhm.
And we don't know what that looks like in terms of a peace settlement.
Right.
And I think that's and this is one of and just so any new listeners know, that peace settlement is an area that Chris has particular interest and expertise. And it is a peace settlement that did nothing but kick the can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
20 odd years down the road, and not even very well. And so the question is would this result in either a peace settlement that removed the desire for Germany to seek retribution as the second half of this this war chapter, or instead would it remove their ability to do so in an effective way?
And here's the thing that I find interesting.
Yeah.
So if you push up German capitulation to January, February 1918, you know what you don't have? Rest-Luft-Tosk.
Oh, that's true. That's a really good point. And so yeah, interesting. So
let me pause for a second.
What does then mean this mean? So have you gotten to the point where you could you salvage the Russian Empire in some way?
I think so let me take a step back, because that was one of my deep cuts. I know it is.
That's a deep cut, Chris. That's a deep cut, but I like it.
Brest-Litovsk was the peace treaty signed between the nascent Soviet Union Bolsheviks and the German Empire in March 1918. The Soviets took power in Petrograd and Moscow in November 1917. And I stress they took power in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow because they didn't really take power in much else of Russia.
And anybody who's interested, there's a couple of really neat maps, like video maps on YouTube that will kind of walk you through who had control when over the territory that we now know as the Russian Federation, and was then the transitioning between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And I think what Chris is absolutely right. It is very interesting how little control the Bolsheviks had at this point. And but what they had was control over key parts of the old Russian Empire, and also, quite honestly, some not insignificant support from the Germans.
And also, they knew what they were doing. The one thing, when you look at the white as opposed to the red movement, the whites were everything from moderate social democrats to proto-fascist to monarchist, and they are just as likely to fight each other as they are the Bolsheviks.
Right.
So let me be very clear. What Eric is talking about, the borders of the Russian Federation as they stood 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Yes. So
this is not going to age well.
Yeah, this is not going to age well. We on a fork of time recognize the borders of the Ukraine, or whatever that's worth.
And by the way, this the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk recognized the independence of Ukraine.
It certainly did.
For the first time in its modern history. So if you don't have Russia leaving the war, or if you don't let's say if you don't have the Eastern Front of the war collapsing the way it did,
right? At least not collapsing. You know, the Russian Empire is likely to not be contributing all that much to the war effort, but at least it's not collapsing and seeking a separate negotiated peace.
But if Germany surrenders in the time frame we're talking about, there is still enough standing of the czarist system, and that I think the West might even be able to intervene, as they did in the Civil War, and restore some semblance of the empire, which is important for this settlement that we're talking about. Because
that could be its own podcast. I mean, yes. I could easily say I could easily see the West saying, okay, we will, Nicholas II, we will put you back on as Tsar of Russia, but congratulations on your new constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
I could easily see something like that occurring.
And the whole reason that, and I promise I'm going to, you had a good idea, so I want to get to that, and I'm going to try and close this up.
You're good.
Come back to
this has been a wonderful tangent, Chris. I really enjoyed this.
The whole reason that Versailles fails the way it does, or as spectacularly, is because not only is Germany frozen out of the settlement, the Soviet Union is also frozen out of the settlement.
They are, in a way that the Russian Empire would not have been.
Or the Russian Republic now.
Okay, yeah. We're going to say the United Kingdom.
You know what?
All the Russias.
the Romanov whatever, because they're not even just Russians.
Right.
Whatever Eastern power there is there would have a seat at that table and would have been involved in it, so that throughout the 1920s, Germany can be as upset as they want, but as soon as they get cute, they're facing a two-front war.
Right.
They do not have this miniature baby boom compared to France and the other countries. So maybe we did it. Maybe we finally figured out a way to do it. Stop World War II. I don't know.
Stop it with the flu.
Yeah.
That would be very interesting if we stopped it with the flu. Or if they did, it would be, like you said, it would, if Germany tried to get cute, they would be facing a two-front war.
Yes.
And I wonder, among other things, Chris, the one country that I'm very curious about in a different sort of negotiation that would include, again, we're going to call it the Russian Republic. What is the status of Poland in that case? Does it become much more under Russian influence as it did after the Second World War, or a Russian ally? So let's assume a somewhat more benign Russia after World War I. I almost said between the wars, but let's assume World War II doesn't happen. So let's assume a somewhat more benign Russia that is looking much more kindly on Poland as an ally and not as a potential conquest target. Would any sort of aggression by the Germans be met not with the phony war with the British and the French, but a real defense with the Polish of Germany by the Russians, if they would get really cute, or if you would even get there?
Oh, you wouldn't know, because don't forget, even when our baby boom hits 20 in 1938, you don't get to the invasion of Poland because Czechoslovakia had a defense pact with the Soviet Union.
Okay, they did. That's true.
And it was the abandonment of the Western powers that the Soviet Union stood back and was like, you know what, we can't.
Well, so do you even get, so let's take this in order. So 1936, rearmament of the Rhineland. Is that allowed? Do people kind of give that a pass still? Again, we're assuming that Hitler still comes to power. We're assuming that we still have some sort of Nazi Germany, even though it may be somewhat diminished with fewer fewer young people of the appropriate age. So do you still have the rearmament of the Rhineland? I'm going to say yes.
I think on that case, yes. Yes.
Do you still have Anschluss with Austria?
Yes, because that is still.
I agree. Pan-German.
Okay. Yeah.
So I agree.
Yes.
And so then I think the straw then becomes the Sudetenland.
Yeah. That's where, but again, now you're dealing with a unified Europe. And by the way, the other thing is, I touched on this. French strategy was based upon sitting behind the Maginot Line because they couldn't fight in Germany. They could not behave the way they did in the First World War. They did not have enough young men to do it. Period.
That's true. They didn't. That's true. Well, and this is, and the French, and I don't get on the French uniquely for this. I mean, we're always fighting the last war. And so it's hard to really fault the French for fighting the last war when, literally everybody has done it.
But their decision to fight the last war was based upon the demographic situation they were facing.
Absolutely. They felt like it was the best they could offer with the tools they had at their disposal.
Yes.
Absolutely. I completely agree, Chris. So I think this is really very interesting. So I think we've, if not totally prevented some sort of conflict that happened in the late 1930s, then seemingly given a plausible reason why the broader World War II does not develop. So I like it. So we've done it. So sorry, Don, we've not, Chris and I are now retired from podcasting. We've solved everything. It's all done.
So when we started down this road, you had some interesting ideas about your own kind of fork.
Yeah.
So let's take it back to our real timeline.
We're taking it back to the real timeline. So again, 1918. So let's assume, because so many things happen by random chance. So Chris jokingly referred to the slaughterhouse in Kansas City where this originated, and that we have no evidence of that. It just it's just something that could potentially fit. But again, we know in 1918 this occurred in Fort Riley, Kansas, which is some 120 miles from where I'm currently sitting. And so let's assume that didn't happen at all. So the wrong chicken wasn't slaughtered in the slaughterhouse in an area of Kansas City that I would call the West Bottoms, that we know that there were slaughterhouses in. Again, that's about 5 miles from where I'm sitting now, and it didn't happen. So no influenza happened at this time.
Or frankly, the chicken infected died before it got to that slaughterhouse. Or died anything like that
spot. Anything that happened. And so my fork was, there was no pandemic. And because there was no pandemic, we, Chris and I agree that we think that the timing of the pandemic that occurred more over 1918 and 1920 did not probably appreciably affect the outcome of World War I. So we'll say that is largely the same. That is largely the same what happened. But what was interesting is the deaths that resulted from this pandemic exacerbated already existing work shortages that happened as a result of war casualties. So you had your war casualties that occurred, and then you had millions of people who had also died from the pandemic. Now, this has a number of implications. Some of this actually might address some of the issues that Chris was talking about. It might actually change some of the demographics of Europe that might make a future World War II either more likely, depending on what happened with German demographics, or less likely, depending on what's happened with things like British, French, or Russian demographics. So, this is very interesting. And this is highly speculative because we don't really know what's going to happen here. What we think we can say, or what I think we can say, is three things. I had hinted before about the professionalism of nursing. That could have possibly been delayed if there was no pandemic to prove very obviously to the population how valuable nursing care was.
When you were talking about nursing care, I'm reminded of Downton Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
In their second season, where that is, nurses are just something that dilettante upper class women can become to help with no training whatsoever, no expertise, rather than something that requires real professional level training.
Right. Well, and to this day, the medical model and the nursing model of care remain somewhat distinct, even though the underlying science behind them is the same, and it just becomes different ways of taking care of the patient. And so I think that I wonder if that professionalism of the nursing profession, or I shouldn't say professionalism, because it implies that the nurses at that point were in some ways unprofessional, which I don't believe to be true. It's more the professional recognition of nursing as an important profession. And I wonder if that would have been delayed to some degree. And similarly, because it was disproportionately men who were affected by war casualties, and were actually in some cases affected by disproportionately by the influenza itself. Some of which is just because there were just higher numbers of men in close spaces because of the war effort. But there were also higher numbers of men who were co-infected with tuberculosis. And as you might imagine, co-infection with influenza and tuberculosis is kind of bad for business. And so we did see a higher number of those men. Well, what does that mean? That means more women in the workforce. And we know that there were more women in the workforce if you look at between 1914 and 1920. That was a higher rate. And so you wonder if this, and coupled with already existing inertia within the progressive movement, improved the overall status of women in society. This is, again, nobody wants 50 million people to die, but we do like to hear that the lot of women has been improved. Similarly, because of the overall labor shortages, those men and women who were in the labor force could strike a better bargain in that workforce. And so we saw a lot of so many of us who are full-time employees, Chris and I included, derive a lot of benefits from, besides our salaries, from our jobs. So we have, and some of us are unionized. I don't know if Chris, if you're in a union, I'm not. But Chris may be in a union. I don't know. And aside from that, we have different benefits in terms of insurances, retirement benefits, other things that result from our employment. Some of these, what we're talking about, are a little U.S. centric, but even some of these social welfare programs in Europe seem to have had their genesis in the trauma that resulted from World War I. You might speculate that those might be somewhat delayed if there weren't there wasn't that force there to make that happen. And so it makes me wonder if some of those kind of social welfare movements and also the improvement of the integration of women into society would have been unfortunately delayed by this. And that there would have had to have been some other sort of stimulus that would have prompted that to occur.
So I have a really interesting kind of, let's go off the rails some more.
Okay.
Throw something else in there.
All right.
I'm reminded a little bit of what I've heard of Europe after the Black Death.
Yes.
How that to some extent set up the Renaissance because of the increased value of labor.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about something that was going on in Europe and the United States in 1919, 1920.
Okay.
The first Red Scare.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Let's talk about that, because that is interesting.
So real history, what happened is the Bolsheviks won, and there was this idea under classical, like, Marxist ideology that once one country went socialist, communist, the workers everywhere else would rise up and say, we want our share of the pie, and sweep away the existing structure. And if you look at how Germany actually got out of the war, there's an argument to be made for that. I'm closing my eyes and I can still see the mental image of police officers in the United States dressed in those masks. But the other thing that's going on is you had police strikes in Boston and in Seattle. You had a massive wave of strikes all over the country. And one of the reasons that it subsided the way it did was because you had these young men coming back from the war that flooded the labor market and diluted the power of some of these strikes.
Right.
So what does that bring up for you?
Yeah, well, it makes you wonder if the strikes would have happened in the first place.
Or if they would have been more successful because they don't have, like you said, labor is scarce.
Well, in this case, where labor is less scarce, if there's no influenza at all, so
right.
So the labor is less scarce. Okay. And so if you're looking at this from a collective bargaining standpoint, the power tilts away from labor and more towards the owners, and so either the workers decide against striking and take a different tactic, or if they strike, it's much easier for them to be broken.
Right. So that, that. So you're saying basically without the influenza strain, we may not have the New Deal.
Well, maybe. And
okay.
Or at least it didn't happen at the time.
Okay.
So I will be fatalistic here, and I will say that, considering the proximity of humans to other animals that we know can harbor influenza strains, the influenza pandemic, I think, was inevitable. It's just a matter of whether it happens. Did it happen as Chris says in 1917? Did it happen as it did in our timeline in 1918, or does it happen later on?
Okay.
Does it happen in the 1920s, or does it happen in the early 1930s when the U.S. is already reeling from a Great Depression? And so, we think about the Great Depression and the New Deal being part of the response to that as, again, being inevitable, but it wasn't. The New Deal was, in my opinion, a very moderate approach to a significant problem. What if that, let's just say it didn't happen in 1918, it happened in 1933.
And this was the other thing that I was thinking about when you mentioned delaying it. One of the things, at least in my mind, was the war, the First World War, accelerated it. It changed it. It changed it from a swine flu to a SARS-CoV-2, in that it really spread it around the world. If this happens in 1925, maybe you don't have the same conditions to spread it. But if you're talking about it in 32, 33, I don't remember seeing a whole lot of outhouses in Hoovervilles.
No, there weren't that many, and so you would have a much slower infection rate
Okay.
at that point, at least in the United States. So again,
Okay.
we're making some assumptions here, and so maybe it wouldn't have originated. Again, we're making some assumptions because it was first seen in Kansas that originated there.
Mm-hmm.
We really don't have great evidence to suggest that it did, but for the sake of argument, we're saying that it did. Kansas not particularly densely populated in the absence of lots of military. But there are places in Kansas and places in the Midwest where you could see a much quicker spread. And the two cities that come to mind are Chicago and St. Louis at that point, which are to this day still more densely populated cities. So where you could see at least a quicker transmission. And by 1933, the world in general is a more connected place than it was in 1918, war notwithstanding, but not like it is in 2022. And so I still think you would see a slower emergence of the influenza because of the way the world worked at that point. It could still be very disruptive, and you wonder, in an already reeling U.S. from the Great Depression, could this be the straw that broke the camel's back? And so instead of seeing instead of a permanent decrease in the amount of social works programs, do you then see the emergence of a completely socialist U.S. at that point? Do you see a collapse of what we consider our form of government, and then you have a United Socialist States of America that is in some ways a counterpart to the USSR? That is a reach, Chris.
That's a very, very, very big reach.
It's a big reach.
Yeah. I can't get there.
No, that's okay. I think it would take a lot. I think you would have to have a lot of additional instability. It would have to be an exceptionally bad pandemic. You would probably have to have other external forces there to make the current U.S. structure more unstable for that to be in any way compelling to the population. And you would also have to have somebody who would be willing to lead that, and it would not be FDR, of course. Right. And it is a reach that will require multiple steps, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah. I almost see it's just as likely to go the other way.
Oh, fascist U.S.?
Yeah.
I don't disagree. I think that's equally likely.
Yeah. Because
for the first time since we've been working together, Chris, I have you speechless.
That's it. Yeah. And we've also gotten World War II prevented. I think
we've prevented World War II. We've created a socialist, if not communist or fascist U.S. And we've all done this with a simple virus.
Yes, with something invisible to the naked eye.
Invisible to the naked eye. Absolutely.
So the moral of this is Kansas City barbecue destroys Western civilization.
That is not the moral of the story, Chris. That is definitely not the moral of the story. And I think, here's and Don will undoubtedly listen to this. What I think would be fun, and I think some of our Texas friends in the podcast would be interested in joining us, is I think we should have a patrons only Q&A.
Okay.
Where all of us with it, and for those of us who don't recall, everybody knows that I'm from Kansas. Chris is from North Carolina.
Yes.
And Robert,
basically anybody else involved in the podcast. Everybody else is Texas. Yeah.
And these are three of the epicenters of barbecue. Admittedly, Kansas City, of course, is the best. And but we should have
where is the mute button? Where is this mute button?
We should have a taste test among some of the group of us, and you know, and maybe blinded which barbecue we like the best. I think this would be really interesting.
Okay.
I don't know how we're going to do that over Zoom, but we can figure out a way. I think that might be fun for the patrons. That would be a little lighter than our usual fare.
Where we do come up with other ways to destroy Western civilization.
We do come up with other ways to destroy Western civilization. And so maybe just some benign arguments over meat would be better.
Okay.
So very nice.
Do you have any other, because I know you were really interested in doing this episode. Do you have any other? Yeah.
Well, I'm always interested in, you know, again, any historical events that have medical implications that are always going to be interesting to me. Okay. And I think this is one of the ones which have a lot of medical implications. And, you know, Chris, I think you and I really did a nice job of going over those in great detail. There's an infinite number of these that we could do, but, you know, this is and even though the podcast is getting a little more long form, it's not that long form. And I don't know that anybody would really have the patience. Maybe, you know, there may be a couple of people, but I don't know if anybody would really have the patience for, you know, a 3-part episode of Eric talks about the flu again. I don't know that I'd listen to that one.
I'm imagining a Venn diagram with H1N1's on one side and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the other, and there's not a whole lot of overlap.
There's not a whole lot of overlap. So that's why there's a reason why this is a 1-parter, everybody. I think the 1-parter can work, but I think a 3-part marathon would be would maybe be not as exciting. So no, I think we've done this topic some justice, Chris.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone for listening to us. If you're interested, you know, please give us reviews or reach out. We'd love to have some more people. Trying to think, maybe a St. Louis representative. Do they really have Memphis? If you're listening to us from Memphis, please reach out and take part in this barbecue challenge.
And stop putting coleslaw on your barbecue.
Yeah. So for Chris and Eric, just signing off and thanking everyone for their time listening to us today. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.